I ran the hardware store with my own hands for 31 years. And the summer my youngest son turned 7, I let him paint the sign out front because he begged me for 3 solid weeks, and I couldn't say no to him twice. He got green paint on his shoes and his forehead and the neighbor's dog, and I laughed so hard I had to sit down on the front step. 26 years later, that same son sent me a letter through his attorney telling me to vacate the premises by the 1st of the month. What he didn't know was that his father had already settled that question. He just hadn't read the answer yet. Welcome back, folks. If you're new here, pull up a chair and stay a while, because this one doesn't start easy, and it doesn't end the way my son planned it. Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and if stories like this one land somewhere real for you, hit like and subscribe, because we've got plenty more where this came from, and every one of them is true. My name is Russ Dade. Everybody calls me Russ. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years running Dade Hardware on the corner of Millbrook and 2nd Street in Clover Falls, Indiana, a town small enough that I knew which customers needed a bag carried to their car before they asked. I inherited the store from my father, Raymond, who built it in 1971 from a single rented bay and a handshake loan from a man named Gus Ferretti, who ran the diner across the street. My father used to say the store wasn't a business, it was a promise he made to the town. I believed him. I still do. My wife Carol was the one who kept the books. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, she'd sit at the little desk in the back office, with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and her coffee going cold beside her, because she always forgot to drink it when she was concentrating, and she would go through every invoice and every receipt with a patience I have never once been able to match. She caught a billing error from a supplier in 2004 that saved us $11,000, and when I told her she was brilliant, she told me she just paid attention. That was Carol. She paid attention to everything. She remembered the names of our customers' grandchildren. She knew which regulars were struggling, because she noticed when they started buying fewer supplies, and she'd quietly let certain invoices run a little longer than they should have, and she never once put that in the ledger in any way that made those people feel small. She said dignity was worth more than 30 days on a net payment. She meant it. I want to tell you about my sons, because you need to know who they are before I tell you what they did. My older son, Marcus, is 41. He's an attorney in Indianapolis, real estate law, mostly. He got the sharp mind I always hoped for, and somewhere along the way he also got a certainty about things that I never fully trusted, the kind where a man stops asking questions because he already believes he knows the answers. Marcus never came back to Clover Falls after he passed the bar. Not for summers, not for holidays unless Carol called 3 times and made his favorite pot roast, and even then he'd find a reason to leave Sunday morning instead of Sunday night. His wife Diane is a pleasant woman who has never once called me dad, even though I've known her for 12 years. My younger son, Danny, is 37. He sells software out of Chicago, makes good money, spends it fast. Danny is the charmer. He's the one who got paint on the neighbor's dog, the one who could talk his way into or out of anything. And for most of his life I found that quality more entertaining than alarming. I should have looked closer. Carol passed away 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from the phone call to the end. I won't dress that up for you, friends, because it doesn't deserve to be dressed up. It was fast, and it was merciless. And the last morning I sat beside her in that hospital room, she held my hand and didn't say much, and I think she knew that what she needed to say she'd already said over the course of 40 years, and it didn't need repeating. After she passed, I kept the store open. People told me to take time, and I tried. And what I found was that the store was the only place where things still made sense to me. I knew where everything was. I knew what it weighed and what it cost and who needed it. There is a comfort in that kind of knowledge that I cannot fully explain to you, except to say that a man who has lost his North Star needs something steady under his feet. My flaw, and I'll tell you this right now so you don't have to wonder about it later, is that I assumed my sons felt about the store the way Carol and I did. I assumed that because they'd grown up between those aisles, because they'd swept that floor and stocked those shelves as teenagers, they understood what it represented. I never sat either of them down and said plainly, This store is not an asset on a balance sheet. It's your grandfather's promise, and your mother's Tuesday mornings, and 31 years of this town trusting us. I assumed they knew. That assumption cost me more than I can tell you. I want you to meet a woman named Sylvia Crane before we go further, because she matters to this story more than my sons do. In the end, Sylvia is 53 years old. She moved to Clover Falls in 2019 when her husband took a job at the plant outside of town, and she started coming into the store that first October because she was renovating an old Victorian on Hawthorne Street almost entirely by herself. She'd come in twice a week, sometimes more, and she always knew exactly what she needed, but she'd linger a while, and she and Carol got to talking the way women do when they recognize something in each other. By the winter of that year, Sylvia was one of the people Carol would call when she wanted to talk about something that mattered. When Carol got sick, Sylvia showed up at our house on the third day with a container of soup and a very practical list of questions about what Carol needed and when. She didn't ask if she could help. She asked which shifts needed covering. There's a difference between those two things that I didn't fully understand until I lived it. She drove Carol to the clinic on Tuesdays for 6 weeks straight. She sat in waiting rooms with a paperback she never read because she was always watching for Carol to come out. She fixed the gutter on our back porch one Saturday morning while I was at the hospital, and when I came home and asked why, she said the drip was going to rot the siding by spring and Carol would want it handled. She never asked me for a thing. She still hasn't. There is also a young man named Theo Briggs who has worked in my store since he was 19 years old. He's 28 now. He came to me for a part-time job during community college, and he never left, and I never asked him to leave, because Theo is the kind of worker who notices what needs doing before you tell him, and does it before you ask. He reorganized the entire fastener section in 2022 without telling me. Just did it one Sunday on his own time because he'd noticed customers couldn't find what they needed, and when I came in Monday morning, I stood in that aisle for a full minute just taking it in. He apologized for not asking first. I told him the only thing he needed to apologize for was the fact that I hadn't thought of it myself. During Carol's illness, Theo ran the store. Not managed, it ran it. He opened every morning and locked up every night and handled the supplier calls and the inventory, and the one occasion where a pipe burst in the back storage room, and he never once made me feel like I was absent, even when I was. He just handled it. Now, I need to tell you about the night everything changed, because I remember it exactly. It was a Thursday in March, a little after 8 in the evening. I was in the back office going through some paperwork when my phone rang, and it was Marcus. He never calls on a Thursday. He barely calls at all. "Dad," he said, and his voice had that attorney quality to it, the kind where every word is placed deliberately. "Danny and I have been talking." I waited. "We've been looking at the store's numbers. The building, the land value, what the corner property is worth now given the commercial development on that end of Millbrook." He paused. "There's a regional chain that's been acquiring independent hardware stores in the Midwest. Good acquisition prices. We think you should hear them out." I asked him what that meant exactly. "It means we think it's time to have a real conversation about your future, Dad. You're 64. You're running a retail operation by yourself. The margins on independent hardware are brutal, and they're not getting better." Another pause. "We've already taken some preliminary meetings." I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it. "We've already taken some preliminary meetings." Not, "Dad, we had an idea we wanted to run by you." Not, "Dad, can we talk about what you're thinking for the next few years?" They had already taken preliminary meetings about selling a store that has my father's name on the sign and my wife's handwriting in the ledger. I kept my voice even. I told Marcus I'd heard him and I needed some time to think. He said they needed an answer within 30 days because the acquisition timeline had windows. I told him I understood, and I got off the phone. I sat in that back office for a long time. I looked at Carol's desk. I looked at the chair she sat in every Tuesday and Friday morning with her coffee going cold and her reading glasses in her hair. And I thought about a Tuesday afternoon, about 14 months before that phone call, when I had driven to see an attorney named Barbara Whitfield in the county seat, because my right hand had started shaking some mornings, and the doctor at Mercy General had given me a diagnosis I wasn't ready to share with my sons yet, and I had decided I needed to get my affairs in order quietly and on my own terms. Here is what my sons did not know. 14 months before Marcus called me about preliminary meetings, I had restructured everything. I had placed the store, the building, and the property into a family LLC. I retained full operational control and a lifetime right to manage and draw income from it. But the ownership interest, the actual equity, the thing my sons were imagining selling to a regional chain I had already transferred. 49% went into a trust with Theo Briggs as the named beneficiary, to vest fully upon my death or my voluntary retirement, whichever came first. 49% went into a separate trust for Sylvia Crane's daughter, a 20-year-old named May, who had spent 2 summers helping in the store, and who Carol had told me, in one of her last clear conversations, had the sharpest mind for people she'd seen in a girl that age, and that somebody ought to give that girl a real chance. The remaining 2% stayed with me, enough to maintain control for as long as I was standing. I want to be honest with you about why I did it, because it wasn't spite, even though I know how it sounds. I did it because of something Carol said to me on a Sunday evening about 3 weeks before she passed, when she was having a good hour and we were sitting together in the living room with the television off. She said, "Russ, don't give what we built to people who see the price of it. Give it to people who know the weight of it." She said it once. She didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. I sat with that for a year before I acted on it, and when I finally did, it felt less like protecting myself and more like carrying out an instruction she'd left me before she went. I didn't tell Marcus or Danny, partly because I knew what the argument would look like. Partly, and I'll admit this honestly, because some part of me still believed I'd never have to prove it was necessary. Marcus proved it was necessary. I let 30 days go by without calling him back. On the 31st day, a certified letter arrived from his firm. I opened it at Carol's desk with my reading glasses on. It informed me that as co-heirs to the Dade family estate, Marcus and Daniel Dade were exploring their legal options with regard to the business assets of Dade Hardware, and that in their assessment the LLC structure I had created was subject to challenge, and that the family would benefit from a mediated conversation about equitable distribution. The family. They used that word and meant only the 3 of us. I read the letter twice. Then I called Barbara Whitfield and read it to her over the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the driest tone I have ever heard from an attorney, "Russ, they can explore whatever they'd like. The LLC is airtight, the trusts are properly executed, and neither of your sons has any standing to compel a sale of an asset they don't own." Then she said, "Do you want me to explain that to them, or do you want to?" I told her I'd handle it myself. I called Marcus that evening. He picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the TV on in the background, some kind of news program, like this was any other Thursday. "Dad," he said, and already his voice had that bracing quality, like he was ready for a difficult client. I told him I'd received the letter from his firm. "Good," he said. "I was hoping we could move past the delay and have a real conversation." I told him I'd be happy to have a real conversation. I asked him if he'd like to start by telling me how many times he'd come back to Clover Falls in the past 3 years. He didn't answer. I asked him if he remembered the name of the woman who drove his mother to chemotherapy for 6 straight weeks. He didn't answer that either. "Dad, this isn't about—" I told him it was entirely about that. I told him the store had been restructured 14 months ago, and that the equity he and Danny were imagining selling to a regional chain belonged, at this point, to 2 people who had actually shown up. I told him that I had documentation, that Barbara Whitfield had documentation, and that the buyer his firm had been meeting with would find, upon any title or ownership search, that Marcus and Daniel Dade had no legal standing to transfer, sell, or encumber any portion of Dade Hardware or the property it sat on. There was a silence on that line that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You gave the store to Sylvia Crane," he said finally. Not a question. More like a man reading a sentence in a language he only partly understands. "And to Theo," I said. "Who's been running that store since your mother got sick and who has never once, in 28 months, asked me for anything beyond his paycheck?" "Dad." His voice changed. The attorney quality went out of it. What was underneath was something younger, something that sounded, if I'm honest with you, like a boy who just realized the ground had moved. You can't. Those people aren't family. I told him that was exactly the problem with his thinking, and that I'd spent a good portion of the last year realizing I should have corrected it sooner. He asked if there was any way to revisit the structure. I told him the trusts were irrevocable. I told him that Theo's interest was protected by language that would take years of expensive litigation to even approach, and that I didn't think his client's acquisition window would survive that timeline. I told him he was welcome to call Barbara Whitfield directly if he had further legal questions. He said he needed to talk to Danny. I told him that was fine and that I hoped the conversation was useful for both of them. He hung up. He didn't say goodbye. That was a Thursday in April, about a month after the certified letter. That was the last time Marcus and I spoke for 6 weeks. Danny called me 2 days later. This was different. Danny doesn't have the attorney's composure, and he's never pretended to. He called from his car, and I could hear the Chicago traffic behind him, and his voice was doing what it does when he's angry, which is, go fast and sharp at the edges. Dad, I can't believe you did this without telling us. I let him go for a while. That's something I learned from Carol. You let a person say the full thing before you answer it, because half the time what they say in the first 2 minutes isn't what they actually mean. He said the store was supposed to be the family legacy. He said Marcus had connections in the acquisition space, and the offer was real money. He said I was being stubborn and sentimental, and that this was exactly what happened when old people made decisions alone. He said that last part and then went quiet, like he heard it himself. I told him I'd heard everything he said, and I wanted to ask him something. I asked him where he was. The Tuesday. His mother needed someone to drive her to the clinic, and I was stuck with a burst pipe in the storage room. And I'd called him, and he'd said he had a product demo. He couldn't move. He said that wasn't fair. I told him it was the most accurate thing I'd said in this conversation. I told him I wasn't angry. I want you to hear that, friends, because it's true. I was not angry at Danny. I was tired in a way that goes past tired. The way a man gets when he's been holding something heavy for a long time, and the people who were supposed to help carry it were standing at a distance, talking about what it might be worth at auction. Danny said, "So that's it? You're just done with us?" I told him I wasn't done with either of them. I told him I'd be right here in Clover Falls and the door was open any time and always would be. I told him the store wasn't a punishment and the trust wasn't a punishment. I told him the store went to the people who showed up, and that was a principle his mother had articulated more clearly than I ever could have, and I'd honored it the best way I knew how. He didn't have anything to say to that for a while. Then he said, quietly, I didn't know she drove Mom every week. I told him that was something I understood, and that maybe the two of us could sit with that together sometime. He said, maybe. And then he said he needed to think, and he got off the phone. The certified letter situation resolved itself within 3 weeks. Barbara Whitfield sent a very polite and very thorough response to Marcus's firm that outlined the LLC structure and both trust documents in enough detail that a first-year associate could have understood there was no viable claim. The acquisition company withdrew their interest. Marcus did not call me. I want to tell you about the morning after Danny and I talked, because it's the part of this I think about most. I opened the store at 7:30 like always. Theo was already there. He'd gotten there at 7, and he'd made a pot of coffee in the back office, and he'd already taken a delivery from the lumber supplier and stacked it correctly and signed off on the manifest. He handed me a cup of coffee when I walked in the back door and he said, "You look like you slept about 40 minutes. I told him that was generous. He laughed. I didn't tell Theo about the trust that morning. I hadn't told him yet. I was waiting for the right time, and I was also, if I'm honest, still working out how to say it without making it sound like a transaction, because it wasn't one. It was something else entirely. I told him that morning about the calls with my sons, not the legal details, just the shape of it. He listened the way he always does, which is completely, without filling the silences. When I finished, he picked up his coffee and looked out the front window at Millbrook Street and he said, "Your dad built something here that people count on. That's not nothing." I told him I knew that. He said, "Whatever you need, Russ, I'm here. Same as always." I didn't tell him yet what that meant legally. But I looked at that kid and I know he's 28. But from where I'm standing, he is still that 19-year-old who showed up asking for part-time work and stayed because he cared. And I thought about my father's handshake loan from Gus Ferretti and how a business that's really worth anything is always built on that kind of trust between people, not on the square footage or the land value or what a regional chain would pay to put their name where my father's used to be. Sylvia found out about the trust about 6 weeks after the calls with my sons. I asked her to meet me at the store one morning before opening, and I told her plainly what I'd done and why. She sat across from me at Carol's desk and she listened to the whole thing, and when I finished, she didn't say anything for a while, and then she said, "Russ, you didn't have to do that." I told her Carol told me to give what we built to people who knew the weight of it. She put her hand over her mouth for a second. Then she straightened up and said, "May is going to need to understand this responsibly. She's 20. I told her I knew that, and that the trust was structured with that in mind, and that Barbara Whitfield would walk them through everything, at whatever pace made sense. Sylvia said, "Carol would have done this exactly this way." I told her I certainly hoped so. We sat in that back office for a while with our coffee. Neither of us said much. There was a quality to that silence that I recognized from the good years with Carol. The kind where you're in the same place with someone, and that's enough. Where the thing between you doesn't need language to stay solid. It has been 8 months since the certified letter. I still run the store. I will run it for as long as my hands work and my legs hold up, and the trust structure means that when the time comes, the transition will be clean, and the people who step in will already know every inch of it, because they've been here all along. Marcus has called me twice since the spring. Both times were brief and careful, the way a man calls when he's rehearsed what he's going to say and is sticking to the script. The second call, about a month ago, was different. He asked how the store was doing, and then after a pause he asked how I was doing. And that was the first time in longer than I could count that he asked that question without a financial follow-up attached to it. It was a small thing. I'm not going to tell you it fixed anything, but I noticed it, and I think he knew I would. Danny came back to Clover Falls in June. He drove up on a Saturday, unannounced, and walked into the store around noon and bought a set of drill bits he absolutely did not need. He wandered the aisles for a while the way he used to when he was a kid, running his hand along the shelves. And then he came to the counter and he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I think I've been looking at this place wrong for a long time." I told him I appreciated that. He said, "I want to come back more." I told him the door was always open and I meant it. He stayed for dinner. Theo joined us because I asked him to, and the three of us sat at my kitchen table, the same one Carol picked out at a garage sale in 2006, and we ate and we talked, and some of it was awkward and some of it wasn't, and by the end of the evening, Danny was telling Theo a story about the summer. He accidentally ordered 300 pounds of the wrong grade of chain link because he'd answered the supplier phone without knowing what he was doing, and Theo was laughing, and I was laughing, and the house felt, for the first time in a long time, like it had some air in it. Danny hasn't apologized in so many words. Not yet. But he came back, and he sat at the table, and he asked Theo about the fastener reorganization with genuine interest. That's the beginning of something. I'll take it. Some mornings I open the store before anyone else arrives, and I stand in the middle of the main floor for a minute before I turn the lights on all the way. In the early light that comes through the front window, I can see the sign my father put up in 1971, the repainted version with the lettering my dad did by hand, and underneath it the smaller line that Carol added in 1996, Family Hardware, Family Service. She added that line on a Tuesday, because of course she did. I think about how my father got that loan on a handshake from a man who believed in him without much evidence. I think about how Carol kept every invoice and every receipt with her reading glasses in her hair and her coffee going cold. I think about Sylvia driving a woman she loved to a clinic every week without asking for recognition, and Theo coming in on his own time to reorganize a fastener aisle because he noticed something wasn't working, and May spending 2 summers learning the rhythm of the place with the kind of attention that Carol recognized immediately because it was the same quality Carol herself had always had. I think about what my father used to say. that the store was a promise he made to the town. I believe now that the deeper promise was to the people willing to keep it. Marcus wants me to be angry. Danny wants me to be forgiving. What I actually am is something quieter than both of those. I'm a man who built something alongside a woman who understood people better than I ever did, and I listened to her when it mattered. And what got built is going to outlast every argument my sons and I ever have about it. Because the people who are going to carry it forward were already here, already working, already showing up without being asked. Sighed. I don't need Marcus to say he's sorry for this chapter to feel finished. I spent a long time thinking I would. I don't anymore. That's probably the part that surprised me most when I got to it. If this one landed somewhere real for you, friends, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and tell me if you've ever had to protect something you built from the people who only saw what it might be worth. Because I think more of you understand exactly what that costs than you might expect. Hit subscribe if you want to stay with us. We've got more stories coming, and every one of them is true, and every one of them belongs to somebody who showed up. I'll see you in the next one.